Good afternoon. My name is Amy Burkert, and I'm the Vice Provost for Education. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our second Journeys lecture of the spring 2011 semester. Journeys is a university lecture series in which Carnegie Mellon faculty, members, and occasionally guests share reflections on their journeys, the everyday actions, decisions, challenges, and joys that make a life. In an essay called Composing a Life, Mary Catherine Bateson, who wrote a book of the same name, writes, "An artist takes ingredients that may seem incompatible and organizes them into that is only workable, but finally pleasing and true, even beautiful. As you get up in the morning, as you make decisions, as you spend money, make friends, make commitments, you are creating a piece of art called your life." She goes on, "Music is an art in which you create something that happens over time, that goes through various transitions. Looking at your life in this way, you have to look at the change that occurs within a lifetime. Discontinuities, transitions, and growth of various sorts. And the artistic unity, like that of a symphony, with very different movements, that can characterize a life." The ULS Journeys lectures began formally in 2007. The first was a famous Randy Pausch lecture, and since then we have shared many beloved faculty members and guest stories, such as Mary Catherine Bateson herself, Sophie Freud, and Milton Fine. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming the creator and architect of the Journey series back to campus. After much coaxing, and all of you who know Indira know that it took a lot of coaxing to get her to do this, the Vice Provost Emerita, Dr. Indira Nair, has agreed to share her own journey. A journey she has entitled, "Teachers All Around Me, My Life of Learning." Like many in this room, I feel quite fortunate to be able to call Indira one of my most important teachers and mentors. She has indeed modeled a life of teaching and learning for many. I am delighted that she has agreed to share her journey and the insights and lessons she learned along the way. At Indira's request, she will be formally introduced by one of her own beloved teachers and mentors, Professor Francis McMichael of the Civil and Environmental Engineering and Public Policy departments. It's my pleasure to call Dr. McMichael to the podium for her formal introduction.
Welcome. This is a great honor to be able to make this introduction. And since I'm a person who often talks and doesn't listen, today we're here to hear and listen to Indira Nair. I'd like to tell you a little thing about her background, and it's a very curious one, because Indira is a risk taker. She teaches risk in communication and uncertainty, but she is not a good role model for all of us. Because, let me begin. Indira was born in Trivandrum, is that right? The capital city of the Indian state of Kerala. It's on the eastern coast of India, near the southern part of the country. Her father was an army officer, and he moved the family many times during her youth, and she attended many different schools. So I'm not sure how much love she has for the city of Trivandrum, but it's known as the Green City of India. That's a quote from Muhammad Gandhi. Perhaps today we're going to hear something about her early life. But in 1962, as a young woman, she studied at the University of Bombay. She earned a bachelor's degree in science and a master's degree in science in physics and mathematics. She was one of five students in India to win a special fellowship to the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. What did she do? She did work on experimental solid-state physics using the Mossbauer effect, which was relatively new at that time. Mossbauer got the Nobel Prize in 1961. I knew him briefly because I was a graduate student when he was a graduate student. But that started her life, and she was going to be a physicist. The motto of the University of Bombay: the fruit of learning is character and righteous conduct. That sounds like Indira, doesn't it? In 1962, India launched the first space rocket from the Space Center near her city. But I'm not sure whether she was paying any attention to that because she was such a physics student. A few years later, in 1967, Professor Nair came to Kansas to earn a second master's degree in physics, and then later that was followed by a PhD in physics from Northwestern. Skip ahead, 1972, she came to Pittsburgh. She said, and I can find various quotes, that she came to Pittsburgh with the intention of pursuing a career as a secondary school science teacher. Had I been her advisor, I would not think that to be a great career move. After several years of pursuing that career, she chose a new path. She's quoted as she took a small job in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at CMU. Credit goes to Granger Morgan for choosing to add her as a colleague. And she started out as a colleague, as a research associate, working on some very specific things. Rarely in her profile do you get a breakdown of how much time she spends on everything. But she modestly said at that time, it'd be about 20% of my time will be spent on research. Well, from that small job in engineering and public policy, little did Granger know what was ahead for him in the university, because the job she was hired for was not the job that she followed. She created all her own jobs. If we look through her record, she went through all of the untenured positions, and they've changed names many times, but she did them all. She went through the tenured positions. They've changed the names a little bit, but she did them all. Then she left the straight pathway that I wished she would follow, and she entered the office of the provost. And most of the university now sees her as a university-wide person. And we've heard of this lecture series, and there are so many others that we can't cover today that she's created at this university. It's not a day to praise and review her record in detail. I see in the audience many of her former students and colleagues and others, and I've read her record recently again. I'd been on various promotion committees for her from eons ago, and it is very moving to read that record. It all comes through with the idea that Indira is different from many others that we have at the university. She says, different disciplines are different lenses. The same thing you are thinking, someone else is thinking from a different perspective. We must learn to see things and learn things in different ways. She often quotes. Today we'll be hearing her words, her perspectives. Many say her best quality is she listens. Today, I will listen, and hopefully you will listen. Thank you.
Oh, I don't know what to do after that introduction. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Amy. I'm so nervous. I'm so nervous. Well, I will start by tradition. Is this it? Will start with a tradition that we come from. An auspicious gathering is always started with Namaste, an offering that combines a prayer, greeting, and homage at the same time. In particular, we bow to our teachers, our gurus. Namaste is complex. It's a complex word. Namaste means I bow to you. There is also the literal interpretation of namaha, which is a negation of the ego, not me. So it says, I'm reducing my ego in your presence. So namaste to you all, and to all my teachers who are here and who are not here. And that's one of the most respectful namaste renditions I've seen on the right. The left one, it is. Very rarely do people, even Indians, do it that respectfully, and I was very touched by that. And this one is a woman dressed in the native garb of my state, Kerala, and actually doing the namaste. But this is how traditionally we are supposed to be dressed. As I nervously thought about this talk, I thought of what I could share that would have meaning for you all and convey the phenomenal opportunities I've had for learning and how it all came together for me in the last 20 years. So this talk is really focused on my intellectual journey and leaves out a large and important part of my life. We don't have time for that. And for a lot of you, it may have no relevance. When I was invited by Paul Cristiano then, to be then the provost, to be the Vice Provost for Education, the 1998 Strategic Plan for Education had just been articulated. One of the first charges in my job was to articulate what strategies would be to work towards this goal for education. It said build upon our educational programs, distinctive in their rigor and focus, by expanding intellectual and personal development. Our students will become broadly educated and humane leaders who will have an important impact on their professions and communities. With a wonderful group of colleagues, many of you here, from all over CMU, we came up with the strategies for broadening the Carnegie Mellon education. The model I used to describe it was the hourglass. The idea is that students, even in their early semesters, here will get to explore around their disciplinary core, even while getting the disciplinary foundations built, so it's not at the price of the core, and find their intellectual place in a more informed way in the disciplines by looking at various disciplines, then focus closely on their core to gain the competencies we want them to gain. That's something that we do well at CMU. Then towards the end of their stay, the curriculum would begin to expand again, this time in understanding how these competencies relate to the world at large. Some of you remember this. I see Scott Sandage here. He was on the committee. And as I unraveled the scheme to the group, Barbara Lazarus said, that's Whitehead. She had recognized that this reflected the scheme of educating that Alfred North Whitehead, philosopher and mathematician, had articulated in his essays called The Aims of Education. And he called these three phases romance, precision, and generalization. While this wasn't universally adopted, nothing is at Carnegie Mellon, it has informed a lot of my teaching as I discovered that it can be a fractal scheme for an entire lifespan or even for an individual course. When I teach, I begin with giving students an overall understanding of the nature of the course and the types of topics and disciplines that it'll cover. It is important to do that, to evoke curiosity, wonderment, and engagement in a broad exploration. Then I focus on the content and building skills and competencies. Finally, the students and I together look at the use of what they learned in the context of the larger world. This hourglass scheme is when a lot of my accumulated learning came together for me. In particular, the final aha came during a conversation with Ginny Stonick, who was then a faculty member in ECE. She said how women are socialized so that they are focused on others early and have to learn to narrow down their perspectives to suit the expectations of a place like Carnegie Mellon, that the kind of perspectives Carnegie Mellon needs of faculty or asks of faculty. But men are socialized to be self and narrowly focused, and then they learn to understand the broader world later, usually after their children grow up. This combination then suddenly came together in my head as the hourglass. That's how we got this. 4 other broad themes integrated and resolved in my head and heart, and I was able to articulate them during these last 2 decades. Looking back for this talk, I picked 4 of them. I realized that these are the evolved states of multiple threads in my upbringing and life experiences. And I had a lot of teachers who helped this happen. The themes that I'll touch on as we go along are the ethic of care, identity, authenticity, and integrity, respect for time and questions, and the kind of literacies that today's students need, and sort of literacy versus expertise, building literacy versus building expertise. But first, some personal details. If this is the story of my intellectual journey, why tell my personal story from another time and another place? Because context and connections are really important for understanding a theme. Often we make the biggest mistakes or appear even inept or irrational when we talk or teach without any context. So my early context for learning. Fran set some of this for me. My early years until the age of 7 was spent completely in the magical state of what is now Kerala, then the kingdom of Travancore, in the capital city which now resumed its original name, Thiruvananthapuram, and was then called Trivandrum, more accessible to the British tongue. So I was born in a kingdom, in a city characterized by an ancient temple, and it was ruled at the time when I was little by a benevolent royal family. We had free breakfast in all schools. Education was already free in our state if you look at the Royal Proclamation of 1817 by one of the queens. Education was already free in our state and compulsory, funded by the royal family. This taught me the benefit of a monarchy, and I credit it is beneficial if it's the right monarch, and this whole family was benign. And I credit our monarchy with the fact that to this day Kerala is an anomaly in its high literacy of 92%, even with a lower than average income per capita than many other states in India. One of my early recollections, and I still can't figure out how they did this, is a state official coming to my house when I must have been 5 and asking why the 5-year-old child indicated by the census is not in school. No computers. How did they know this? Children were supposed to be in school in the first grade by age 4. My mother brought me out for him to interview me. I had been tutored at home as I had a chronic liver illness. She said I would probably enroll the following year, and I did. They tested me and placed me in the 3rd grade. So this magical kingdom is my earliest memory of a state. Every morning in the school assembly, we would first sing God Save the King to King George VI. You can date me. You know of the King's Speech movie. And then in my language, Malayalam, we did a prayer for our king. My father was an army officer, as Fran said, in the Travancore State Forces. He loved animals and gardening. We had cows, goats, hens, ducks, and flowers. So we watched and learned how this officer with a rather commanding presence cared tenderly for these animals. He would call them by their names, and they would actually come and eat from his hands. Cows would do that. That's an early memory of the ethic of care. I remember too the day Gandhi was assassinated, no one cooked and ate the next day in our house and many other houses. Then there was the day we went to a big army show where Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, received the salute from my father. To the night when one of his soldiers had stabbed someone and came to our house with the knife to talk to my father. That's the trust he elicited. For the first few years of my life then, I was in a world of sunlight, green rice fields, butterflies and dragonflies of all sizes and types and flowers. I have early memories of chasing butterflies with my sister and actually trying to feed them goat's milk. We were told goat's milk is the poor butterflies. And before letting them fly again. We began, so that's Kerala. We began a rather nomadic life after India became independent in 1947. I'll go faster, it's not going to take 10 times this time. I was 7, and my father was made the liaison officer from the state to the Indian Army. The Indian Army was just being formed, Royal Indian Army no more. I ended up doing my 12 grades, as Fran said, in 9 schools, in about 6 states, in multiple languages that I had to learn along the way. I had kind teachers, and I learned to learn very fast. Looking back, I don't remember being unhappy at all when we had to move, except for leaving friends. At times, the language barrier was a problem. I remember having to stay after school every day in my first English school as the teacher wrote sentences on the blackboard that I had done wrong, of course, and made me copy each 20 times, sometimes 50 times. I copied, but I didn't learn. I must have been 8. I was back in Trivandrum in school and looking at an atlas for some geography lesson. After watching me for a while, my grandfather said, "Where is your notebook and pencil?" "I'm reading," I said. He said, "Write as you read. You read other people's knowledge. Writing makes it your knowledge." Thus he taught me about internalizing knowledge. Following this early lesson from my grandfather, I still write down any remarkable quote or prose that I come across. My grandfather was an economics professor, poor. He had to study under street lights. He was then noticed by an Englishman who was a professor in a college and who helped him attend the relatively new London School of Economics in the University of London. He went on to head and to transform several educational institutions. I have memories of students dropping in and sitting near his armchair, talking with him. Reading, learning, and music pervaded our home. My grandfather knew 8 or 10 languages, including German and French. So he had books in all these languages. He subscribed to the British magazine Strand and Titbits. And so I read my first Sherlock Holmes in bound volumes of old Strands in which they were serialized. So my passion has been for learning and my fortune to always be surrounded with the most wonderful teachers. When the larger family, 3 generations, got together and the talk turned to gossip, my uncle would say, "Let's go outside and sing and do some algebra." He was an engineer with a remarkable musical talent. He composed, sang in multiple genres, and played all sorts of musical instruments with no training. So we sat outside on the steps of or the veranda and sang and did algebra. Although this was idyllic, I wonder now if this is where I got the tendency to mentally leave the scene when things got weary or scary. I still do it. A tendency for which my daughter calls me Cleopatra, Queen of Denial. Learning, so, sometimes I get Cleo. Learning for learning's sake was the guiding principle in our home. Exams were important before they took place. The rule was that you study well and regularly, do your best, and immediately after the test, discuss with your friends, especially the questions you did not get. Then your job was done. Fretting about grades was not something you did. Grading is the teacher's job, my mother would say. Your part is over, now let it go. To graduate from high school, we had to do a set of exams. This is where I was in one of the high schools. 13 in all, 3 hours each, 2 a day, 5.5 days a week. We went to school Saturday, and 2 the next Monday. The exams covered all the material for the last 3 years. Some of the students are smiling because I've told them this. They were set and graded by examiners from out of state. We could put only an assigned number on the paper, no other identifiers. So you can imagine my surprise when I landed in the US and found that you knew who wrote your exams and who's grading it. And I could never understand why students complained when they had 2 exams the same day and maybe even one the next day. After I had graduated from high school, I went to college in Bombay, where my father was now the chief administrative officer of a new firm called Indira Nair, affiliated with the newly established Atomic Energy Commission. College was a joy. My desire was to study medicine. A tussle began with my mother. Of course, she said I should go to college, I should do very well, I should get a bachelor's degree, but then get married and raise a family. Studying medicine was strenuous and takes time, she said. I started in science, but the second year we had to choose between math and biology. I said I'll take biology as a preparation for med school. That was my secret agenda. But she put her foot down. It was a strong foot. And I did not do confrontation well, so I did math. Later in the very first defiant act of my life, I chose physics over math as my major. My father, in his turn, had wanted to do science, but had been told to do history, tried to side with me to no avail. I had fallen in love with math my freshman year, especially calculus, and physics in my sophomore year. The magic of the ray diagram forming the, what's happening here? Something is happening, I'm stuck, huh? Escape. How do I escape? The magic of the ray diagram forming the caustic curve. There was a faculty member who actually traced out all the rays that forms the caustic curve. I can never forget that lecture. And the physics of bubbles. Being able to represent bubbles of various types mathematically just blew my mind. Then came our first quantum course. We had all had a year of thermodynamics. Our professor, Dr. Gatha, started with a story. He pointed out that we had learned the fundamental concepts of physics up to about 1870. He introduced us to a big question in physics that had emerged at the time, the black body radiation puzzle. He showed us the actual experimental spectrum named by Kirchhoff in 1860. We had enough thermodynamics for him to lead us through the Wien's derivation, and I couldn't make a sufficient background slide for this, through the Wien's derivation of his displacement law in 1896 in an attempt to describe that spectrum. Wien's curve fitted the spectrum at high frequencies, but not at the low frequencies. Lord Rayleigh and Sir James Jeans had derived an equation that predicted the curve correctly at low frequencies, but blew up at high frequencies. It's called the ultraviolet catastrophe. He asked us what would be a simple mathematical trick that would produce the peak correctly and the shape of the curve. He stared at the two equations with us. We just sat and stared. We suggested several mathematical possibilities. And then he said, what if the energy was proportional to the frequency and could only be integral multiples? And he made us, the students, derive the formula and said, that's what Planck did. Find the assumption that has the math that fits the curve. That historical development was so powerful. We spent 2 classes sitting and staring at the past thing to come up with Planck's equation. It so resonated with me that all I read the next few weeks are accounts of this story, and many were to be had. Since then, I've become an ardent follower of the history of ideas, especially in physics. I believe that presenting the historical context, early ideas refined, corrected, restated, can be a powerful way for teaching science. Greg Franklin and I followed this approach and had a lot of fun teaching a course on Einstein that we call The Year is 1905, E equals mc squared, relativity, and photons. Students from all majors did concept maps of the progress on models of matter, of motion, of light in this course. In college, we didn't have textbooks, but rather a syllabus. So I learned to look for the best treatment in different books for each topic and had my favorites among books. As we had these marathon exams again for the bachelor's degree, 10 exams all in physics over 7 days, and 4 4-hour lab exams. And as I lived closest to the school, I would go as soon as the library opened, check out all kinds of books, because we couldn't take it out of the library because it was study time, and get them all out on the balcony. This was good weather place, where all our classmates, 27 of us, would come, and it would become a reading room with us explaining things to each other. I loved the challenge of explaining the Zeeman effect to different peers in different ways. We were a bunch of physics groupies. So we were ecstatic when the University of Bombay asked for volunteers for the Indian Science Congress in 1960. The guest of honor was Niels Bohr, who gave lectures on human knowledge and atoms. And some of you know who Niels was. And the principles of quantum physics. So we got to see him and his wife. George Gamow was there, Irene Curie was there. We just stood and gawked. I finished a master's degree in physics, as Fran said, and did 1 year of research from 62 to 63 in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay, setting up for experiments using the Mossbauer effect. Rudolf Mossbauer was the youngest physicist and was a graduate student to win the Nobel Prize, and he had only won it in 1961. By then I had found how generous big scientists here in the United States and in the UK could be. I got a treasured piece I had to calibrate, and I needed this 10 mil 410 stainless steel, and I didn't even know what 410 stainless steel was, because that was not the British notation, but the American notation. So I wrote to Dr. G.K. Wertheimer at Bell Labs, who had published some papers, and asked him, how do I get it? Who do I order from? And I got a treasured piece of pure 10 mil thick 410 stainless steel from him by mail. And earlier, as a gift to another friend who was doing his research on ferromagnetism, I had put together a collection of reprints signed by original authors. And some of you might recognize them, among them Felix Bloch, Lev Landau of Landau and Lifshitz, and Van Vleck. At TIFR, I also got to hear Bloch, Lee of Lee and Yang, and many others. Sometimes I didn't understand, but I heard them. Bala and I were married in 1963. And so I want to share a picture with you. This is my father. This is at my sister's wedding. So this is my sister and her new husband. That is, you can see me and Bala, much younger. My father is here, and my brother is in the glasses below. My other sister, so I have 2 sisters and a brother. My other sister is at the end. My mother is here with Nandita as a little baby, and my sister-in-law is up there. So I just wanted to, so that you see what the characters look like. In 1967, Bala, our baby Nandita, and I landed in Kansas State for graduate study. I re-entered physics after a break of 5 years. The physics department was good to me. Some of my first culture shocks came in Kansas. When I would ask people for preferences in the early time, I'd say, shall we do this? And they would say, oh, I don't care. This usage of care, we used to say, I don't mind, bothered me. I had never seen such uncaring people until I caught on to the usage. And I thought I knew English. But like one of our instructors told me, when we all had to take English tests when we entered, who were teaching assistants, and Mr. I don't remember his name, close cut, he told me, we don't care if you know the Queen's English. We want you to speak Kansan American. The other one was the question, do you want to do something if you ask? People ask you that, meaning you are assigned to do that. It wasn't a question. The first time I was a TA for a lab, and Mr. Green, our lab supervisor, chose the simplest experiment and asked me, Mrs. Nair, you want to set this up? I thought I should pick a harder one, because that was the Indian ethic, right? And I said no. People looked at me strangely and I didn't understand why. And he assigned me another one. It was months later I realized I was supposed to just say yes, because it was a command and not a question. I passed my qualifiers in Kansas. I had also developed a way to grow single crystals of potassium azide for my experiments at Kansas, which was studying the phonons and from there getting the crystal structure by Raman scattering. Small lasers were just becoming affordable. I loved the sight of the pure neon laser beam, 6,328 angstroms in the dark. I realize now that it evoked my early romance with light. At Kansas State, we had the incomparable experience of seeing and hearing two great people, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Doesn't it sound like Forrest Gump? I suddenly realized. I just realized that when I did this. No pictures or videos do justice to the majesty and speech. And you have to see these people alive. I know you guys missed it, but it has to. They're just phenomenal. And we were just this far because we went early for seats. In 1969, Bala got a job in Chicago and we moved to Evanston. I came to Northwestern and finished my PhD there under a strange man, my advisor, Dr. Tom Walker. He gave us each a small budget that we could spend on small equipment without asking him. For an alloy that I was annealing very slowly, I bought very pure, very, very pure, expensive graphite crucibles. Blew my whole budget for that semester. I left a nugget of the alloy in the crucible and found 3 days later, for it annealing slowly, found my expensive crucible was gone. Now, one of the people who helped me immensely to prepare for this talk, by the way, is Karen Bernsen. She slashed and burned, and then she made me rewrite stuff. And Karen said I couldn't. I was going to leave this to you as a puzzle as to what happened. And Karen said I had to tell you the answer. I reported the security and I made a big fuss before I solved the puzzle. I'm still tempted to call some of you by name and ask what happened. Slow oxidation. Carbon had turned into carbon dioxide, which is a gas, and had escaped. Of course, I never lived it down with my advisor. As soon as I came to Northwestern the summer before I enrolled, Walker gave me a research assistantship. Told me he wanted me to move fast, do my quals in September, and start my research. But first he said we have a practice in our group. It was his pride that no two students of his group worked on the same area. The newcomer gives a set of lectures on the theoretical foundations of the work they are planning to do, and that these seminars were always 7 to 9 p.m. I said, I'll do my talks on crystal groups and light scattering. With my Indian education, I knew how to derive everything from first principles. So he would look quizzically as I presented stuff, and then ask me to derive some corollary, and I just did it, right? In those days, I had no trouble. After my series was over, it was that one of the members of our group, John Gustafson, asked me, "You do know this is the first time a new person had to give these talks." Walker told me much later that I was his first woman student and that I had passed the test. I had demonstrated competence. And I had come back after working hours, even with a small child at home, hence the 7 to 9 p.m. Lots of Walker stories, but I'm going to resist. I did get a PhD in the end. It was at Northwestern that I became more convinced that I would love to teach physics to young students, and that a PhD would help me do it right and convey the excitement. A big lesson stands out from then. I was walking my 5-year-old daughter Nandita to school, and there was an oil slick on the ground, and it had dispersed the sunlight. "Look, Amma," Nandita said, "a rainbow fell to the ground." I began, she knew her graduate student mother. And my explanations. So she broke in, "Please don't tell me about light rays and stuff. Let me think that there's a rainbow on the ground." My little one taught me the need for wonder in life and in teaching. Anyway, as I finished my PhD and started a postdoc, Bala got a dream job in Pittsburgh. And I began teaching physics and science at a wonderful high school called, what was it called? Canevin. Actually, Mac was at Canevin once upon a time, where I solidified my teaching. I still keep in touch with some students and co-teachers. I had to get 6 credits of Catholic theology to get the diocesan certification, and that gave me an important insight into my students and their context. Canevin was wonderful, and I'll stop there. I can tell you lots of stories. Sarita, our second daughter, was born while I worked there. So this is the Canevin motto. Did you know that, Mac? Sarita, our second daughter, was born while I worked there, and I could tell you a lot of tender stories about student concerns while I was pregnant with her. September through May, I felt cocooned in love and care. I learned so very much about young learners in this culture, something many of us coming from abroad and doing a PhD and becoming faculty never learn, or learn only when they have children in schools here. I love high school students and the wonder you can invoke in them with physics and learning. My children have been among my greatest teachers. Sarita was in 3rd grade. She was talking about her friends and her problems. "So what did you say?" I asked. So this is Sarita and Nandita. That's Nandita with my godson sitting at Sarita's graduation. And the photographer is in this room. My children have been among my greatest teachers. Sarita was in 3rd grade. She was talking about her friends and problems. "So what did you say?" I asked. She said, "It wasn't about my saying, it was about my listening." This is an advice I followed again and again when I was advising. One of her greatest qualities to this day lies in knowing about but not judging her friends. In fact, most people. I left Canevin sadly as we bought a house in Irvine and moved there to Bala's work, which was now at the Waltz Mill site of Westinghouse near New Stanton. After a year of substitute teaching, a small ad in the now extinct Pittsburgh Press for a part-time technical writer in a new department at CMU brought me to Wien Hall to meet with the department head of EPP, Granger Morgan. He hired me instead for half-time as a research assistant postdoc and the other half to do administrative work. When I said I didn't know much about engineering or public policy, he said, "You learn." And that was always his attitude. He had been here for 4 years and ahead for 2 years then. We made up a lot as we went along, and I learned to do things. I taught a lot, I advised a lot of students, sometimes whole fraternities because one of them was my real advisee. I became his assistant head 2 years later. There was room to do creative things, and I had wonderful mentors and students in EPP and CMU. Freedom and a trust in our abilities was what Granger gave us, and we flourished, as did the department. Looking back, I realized that Canavin and the India context I brought with me allowed many energies to come together at CMU with its wonderful people and freedom. But I couldn't have done many of these things I did without courage. Rollo May, psychologist, wrote that the word courage comes from the French word for heart, cœur. He says that in the midst of change, we can panic or withdraw, or have courage and create. Physical courage, moral courage, social courage, and creative courage. Well, I was working in EPP, spurred by questions of conscience that some incidents here led me to. I started thinking seriously about how we teach students to think about the impacts of their work. A course, Science, Technology, and Ethics resulted. Having never taken a course in philosophy, I had to get a reading list from my daughter Nandita and be quizzed by her, and I failed several times. I also learned from classes. I started taking classes by Jonathan Pressler, Ernie Aliva, Peter Madsen, Robert Cavalier, Peter Marina Pantasidu, who was a civil engineering professor. Robert and I thought up and worked at supporting faculty who wanted to introduce ethics in their courses. During this time, teaching ethics in context became a passion for me. Marina and I also published a paper in the Journal of Engineering Education on ethic of care in engineering. In EPP, I became aware that teaching a subject for expertise and teaching for literacy need two different pedagogies. And this became relevant even more when I became the Vice Provost for Education. Teaching for expertise is usually done by handing the student the discipline like individual bricks one at a time, and leave the student to build the edifice of the discipline for themselves. Literacy is the skill of being able to find and use the right information correctly and with critical judgment when you need it. Similar to what my grandfather taught me about internalizing knowledge. As I did a project with many of you on environmental literacy, if you remember, we identified 3 components of the pedagogy for teaching environmental literacy: systems thinking, understanding scales of space and time and life cycles, assuming agency, seeing oneself as an agent in the environment. Many of you found creative ways in your disciplines to instantiate this. One of my current lines of thinking is how you teach for various literacies: environmental literacy, ethical literacy, global literacy. Time and questions are 2 aspects that I learned to bring to my classes. It's time and staying with questions. Giving time, as our quantum mechanics professor had given us, to stay with the question of black body radiation, showing students how much time it takes for things to unfold, to own your knowledge, to explore answers to your questions. As I think about time and how cycles happen in our lives, I see my sister Nirmala in Madras working with learning disabled students over years, patiently understanding them in the framework of multiple intelligences to find the right ways for them, and she has succeeded. I recall how 4 years after I had first learned it, hanging on for dear life, standing in a bus in Bombay, I suddenly realized an aspect of the uncertainty principle. I recall my brother Venu saying how, when he was away at engineering college, anytime he was struggling with a homework question, someone always came his way and helped answer them when he most needed the help. He said to me, "It's all those people you helped now coming back to me." I recall Bala working over and over again to correct a new product failure and how much persistence it took to identify and correct the design and to make the design better. The view, the perspective on time is what is different. I also realized between each of the following 3 pairs of words: economy and ecology, cure and care, efficiency and efficacy. I beg you each to reflect on this. I learned this acutely, especially the difference between efficiency and efficacy when I got to an administrative position. We generally think of time use in management on an implicit or explicit metric of efficiency. This is not necessarily the best way to manage a group of people doing education work. Education is about process and efficacy, not about product and efficiency. This, combined with the hourglass thinking, taught me a lesson. If you have a group to manage, make time to bring them together in explorations, and this takes time, so they discover the synergies among their work. Then you focus on each of their needs, but the bringing together must continue in the expansion mode, say they continue to expand their horizons. This is what I found to be a mode for efficacy. It's not efficient in the sense of minimizing the time. Leaving questions open without rushing to answers is something else we old ones need to teach the young and model. One more little story. I was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York with my artist sister Geeta, who had taught me about art and artists as she was learning. We had just been in a small room with impressionist paintings, and I didn't see Geeta and went out to look for her. And then I came back into the room. 3 seascapes by Seurat were on the far wall of this relatively small room, about a quarter of this room. As I came back into the room, about 8 feet from the paintings, I suddenly saw the paintings as the artist meant me to see them. This was the right distance from which to see them. But how did Seurat paint that from a distance much closer? He didn't have those long arms. How did I get that revelation? Was it because Geeta, who first taught me about Impressionists, was with me and I was looking for her? That particular perspective we get when we look at something from the right distance in space or time is what I've come to think of as distance vision. Distance vision is the only edge we have over our students. They can read, they can look at Wikipedia, and this is what, distance vision is what we can convey to them correctly. They can read their textbooks, get their information, but this distance vision, we only can truly give them. Finally, Charlie Post, a student in the old SUPA, who heard me say many times about staying with the questions, sent me a poem by Rilke. Charlie wrote, "This was the message I got from your classes, but Rilke says it's so much better. Be patient," he said, "towards all that is unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves. Do not now seek the answers," Rilke said, "which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them." And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. I'm now on my way to a distant day, to a distant place, to be near my daughters and my granddaughter as we enter a new phase of life. Thank you.